think a lot about generative AI in the music context because it has huge ramification for content creators, for musicians, right? It raises really interesting ethical and legal questions around authorship, and outside of music we see that in other contexts. Any time it's sort of human creativity is coming up against generative AI, I think we're going to have some really big discussions and big challenges in the future.
So after I did research for my book, I'm really not very optimistic for the near future. I'm really hesitant to put on my data in online forums of all kinds, and I realize many people make me to do that, for example, conference registrations, hotels. So my data is nearly everywhere in the internet, and since I was spent a lot of time in the darknet, I saw that sooner or later they will appear in the darknet, because it's not possible to store them securely. So I'm not very optimistic, and I think when it comes to research, we really have to come up with new solutions for social engineering and for security in general, for human-centered solutions.
So, I mean, there's already a language barrier in many cases in these systems. You know, we're generally working in English. A lot of the scientific organizations working in English, whereas a lot of people in rural communities will so in Kenya, for example, they'll be speaking Swahili, and they might understand some English, or they'll be speaking a very local language. And so I don't think that as far as I know, like for instance, ChatGPT, I don't think it's going to cope with those local languages. Right. Perhaps in the future it will. But then it's a case of cost benefit, I suppose. If you want to do something that complex for a very small group of people, then there has to be obviously a very good reason for that. So I think if we assumed that everybody understood English, then there are definitely obvious applications for that. You know, you can, if you want to know what the conditions are going to be like in the coming season or the coming week, then you can ask in a more conversational way, or ask them to put it in terms that you can understand better. So perhaps in the future there are applications for it, but I think at the moment we're looking at quite a long way down the line.
Right.
Yeah, so I think for the design implications, the most practical way is we could give these recommendations for the users or for different designer developers who's doing similar human AI systems, is that you need to be really careful because the effect of having explanation can be subtle and can be really complex. It can have both a negative and positive impact, especially in the short run, because currently I think users' mental model is not prepared for the system to all of a sudden making decisions for them and become smart. Quote.
Right.
But I think in terms of Internet of Things, especially in a smart home context, I think what they should do is actually to make you care less. They should slowly and silently guess your preferences and do their job in a way that you don't need to care them too much. It just requires so much deep customization. It's like you are babysitting them. That's not the future we want. We want a future that we care almost nothing, and the system should do the right work for me.
That's a really big problem at the moment in the climate services research area, is that the climate scientists are so disconnected from the people on the ground who are using this information to make very important decisions that they don't really understand their lives, how they use this information, and the types of information they need. So I think that's where HCI can really help here, is in establishing user needs and better understanding the user.
Hi, I'm Mike Green, a freelance user research lead and digital consultant based in the UK. Welcome to Understanding Users. In this podcast series, I chat with digital experts from a variety of disciplines, including user research, UX and service design, development and product management. And there's even a founder or two. I talk to them about how they came to be in their current roles, what they've learned along the way, and the challenges they face in designing and building digital products and services with users in mind. And while many of these conversations are recorded remotely, I'm also keen to get out into the wild and meet my guests face to face where possible. So in some episodes, you'll hear me prowling the corridors of UX conferences in different parts of the globe to get the views of speakers and attendees alike. These are intended to be relaxed, informal chats with professionals who are keen to share their experiences. So sit back and enjoy. And now a word from our sponsor. Oxford Insights are specialist researchers helping governments and public sector organisations around the world understand and harness technology for public good. From AI to data governance to business analysis, Oxford Insights take a clear, user-centered approach, co-designing projects with you to help define the problem, your approach to solving it, and what success looks like for you. Whether that's a new national strategy, a pilot program, a network of like-minded people from around the world, a media event, or a startup accelerator. Their recent clients include the UK government's Ministry of Justice, the United Nations Development Programme, the Government of Colombia, the International Development Research Centre, and the Development Bank of Latin America. Their AI Readiness Index, which they've run for the last 5 years, or the Human-Centered Design Index that they launched last year, both help countries understand where they stand relative to their peers and how and where to start improving their performance. With 15 years of experience, credibility, and global exposure, the team at Oxford Insights is the key reference point for those seeking to deliver public innovation and bring future policy issues to the centre of government and the public sector today. To find out more about their work, visit oxfordinsights.com. What is generative artificial intelligence? What aspects of generative AI are academics at the cutting edge of research currently investigating? How can UX researchers and designers apply lessons from this research in their own work? And should we learn to love or fear AI? In the second of 2 episodes from the CHI2023 Human Computer Interaction conference in Hamburg, I chat in person with 5 attendees about the events, their own research, and what the future holds for generative AI. There isn't possibly time to cover the vast range of great talks and sessions at CHI2023, but I hope this will give you a flavour of what was on offer and what those who attended took away from the event. Thanks for listening and enjoy the episode.
So my name is Eva Wolfangel, or in English Eva Wolfangel, which is much nicer. I just gave a talk at CHI conference about cybersecurity. So I'm a cybersecurity journalist or a freelance journalist writing about cybersecurity, AI, the metaverse, of course, too.
My name's Sophie Freeman. I'm a PhD student from the University of Melbourne. I am doing research into the user experience of music recommendation on music streaming sites.
My name's Jake Rigby, and I'm based at the University of Bristol in the Bristol Interaction Group. And I'm working on the Down to Earth project, which is about delivering climate information through what we call climate services to different users in East Africa.
I'm Kiwi and I'm a UX researcher at Signify, previously called Philips Lighting.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Torben Volkmann. I'm a research assistant from the university in Lübeck, northern Germany. I'm doing a lot of research in the area of participatory design.
But recently cybersecurity is growing a lot, so this is what I'm talking or writing mostly about. But I really think that this community can help people to be more secure, because the human factor is often underestimated in security.
Yeah, and it was an absolutely fascinating talk. It was the opening keynote this morning, and I made loads of notes, Eva. And the idea, some of the kind of examples you gave of, the physical pen testing, where people are trying to get into organisations and they're paid to almost try and break in, if you like. That's an aspect of, certainly user experience design that obviously I don't come across in my work. But tell me more about that and some of the examples you kind of shared.
Yeah, so this was one thing research I did for my book, trying to find out what we can do against this kind of, it's social engineering, right? These people, so they are pen testers, and of course criminals are doing the same. They try to access buildings they're not allowed to access. And I mean, the easiest way to do this, and this is something I often do myself, is just to sneak in with another person. So someone is opening the door and you just run behind them. And of course, people are totally friendly normally and they let you in. Or if you carry some heavy books or something, they even open the door for you. So that means this social engineering, and especially physical social engineering, is playing with your human condition, that we want to be nice and friendly and communicate to people. And what cybersecurity or security always tells the people, well, you are not allowed to let someone in, just don't do it. But it doesn't work. So this one example was a pen tester. She dressed up as a consultant and tried to access a bank in Hamburg. She wasn't allowed to access, but this was a job to try. And she just carried around many things. I didn't have hands-free to open the door. Then there was a fingerprint sensor where she, of course, her fingerprint wasn't scanned, so she wasn't able to go in. And she told me, well, this is a German bank. I did some research, so Germans don't like if it's loud and noisy and if you rant and curse. So she started ranting and cursing. Then finally a security guy came and told her, well, try the other finger, and then she was screaming at him because she was hurt on one arm, at least she pretended to be so. So she screamed at him, and of course he didn't feel well with that situation. And finally he just opened the thing for her because he just wanted the situation to end and her being quiet again. So this is how these things work.
And in your talk, you were talking about kind of the physical response and how that affects, if people are stressed, it can affect their behavior and their, I suppose, critical reasoning in terms of threat analysis and in terms of security. And that's really fascinating.
Yeah, so this is what I learned during my research. So everything started with phishing emails, right? This is the classical social engineering thing that happens. You get an email and there's maybe malware attached to it, or you click a link and you have to write in your credentials or things like that, and criminals send these things to you. So they make you doing things you don't want to do or not supposed to do. And one thing that they use most of the time is emotions. So they put you under emotions, they threaten you, they make you frightened. So I told the story about a test phishing email I received where I had missed a meeting in a company I was new and I wasn't sure. I thought nobody will realize, but then I received this test phishing email, which of course I didn't know that it's a test phishing email. It said, we missed you at our meeting, please urgently review the document, the attached document, and give feedback. And I was stressed immediately and a bit anxious and thought, oh, now I really have problems. And I just clicked on the document, and this was then the test phishing email. And what I learned from a psychologist who is doing who's doing security research too, is that in these situations when there are emotions, our critical thinking doesn't work properly anymore, or it's just so far in the background that we are not able to think critically and to think, oh, this might be phishing, for example. So we just click on it, or we just do these things. So emotions are, I don't want to say a problem, but it's, and this is the whole thing I was talking about, right? It's not a problem, but it's a problem when it comes to social engineering because we do things we don't want to do. And security research often told me things like this: we are the problem, our nature is the problem, our emotions are the problem. And of course they're not, because it would be sad just to cut all these things off and to say, okay, I don't want to be emotional anymore, I don't want to be polite anymore, I don't want to open doors to people anymore. So this was the whole message of my talk, telling people, well, please find other solutions.
So what implications does this have for digital designers, for designers, researchers in the digital sphere in terms of creating security solutions and security systems to avoid these kind of issues that we as humans all encounter when we're stressed?
I mean, I think most important is really talk to a psychologist. Try to find out about the human nature, and don't try to tell people don't behave as people. I think this is the most important thing. And then, I mean, it's still open. There are so many open questions. There's not a final solution for all these things. But telling people just please don't behave as people, or you should just do it properly, this is something that doesn't help, right? So yeah, I think talk to other disciplines is the first most important recommendation.
So if there was one thing you wanted the audience to take from your talk, what would it be?
Human nature is not the problem. And this is what security research often tells us. But no, human nature is fine. Please be aware of human nature and find solutions that take that into account. Yeah.
And is this your first time at CHI?
It's the second time. I was there when it was in Glasgow, just as a visitor or as a journalist. So I enjoy CHI a lot because I really like the solutions this community comes up with, because they do take humans into account, right, and our nature and everything. And I think security research can learn out from these folks too. And I hope that happens, that there's more cooperation.
And are there any other talks or sessions that you've attended today that have particularly piqued your interest?
So I was at the Alt-CHI right now, which is sometimes funny, or partly funny, partly just research that is not totally typical for the field. And I heard some interesting thoughts about large language models and how to use them to replace the human as in the whole process of research. And of course, I think they don't take this seriously, or they don't mean this seriously, but it was totally interesting to see what AI did learn from training data from past HCI research and things like that.
What benefits, or and equally what challenges does AI pose to cybersecurity and being secure online? Will it make it easier to do so, or in your view, is it becoming harder? Because obviously ChatGPT can create, as you mentioned in your talk, sort of spam emails and that kind of thing, which are very authentic.
I think it's both. So spam emails will be much more authentic in the future. It's much easier, or they scale, right? You don't need many people writing them, so the whole process is scaled, so it's easier for the criminals. But on the other hand, of course, these models and chatbots can help us too to be critical, right? They can remind us to think critical. They could maybe, that's another question. They could check our emails and tell us, oh, please be careful. This could be this and that. But of course, this is what we already have partly, and these systems often create false positives, and this is why people don't trust them anymore. Right. So I have kind of some hope that AI is getting better in this, and that it really helps to solve these things. So after I did research for my book, I'm really not very optimistic for the near future. I'm really hesitant to put on my data in online forums of all kinds, and I realize many people make me to do that, for example, conference registrations, hotels. So my data is nearly everywhere in the internet, and since I spent a lot of time in the darknet, I saw that sooner or later they will appear in the darknet, because it's not possible to store them securely. So I'm not very optimistic, and I think when it comes to research, we really have to come up with new solutions for social engineering and for security in general, for human-centered solutions.
Tell me more about the research that you're doing and kind of how that impacts the end user.
So I'm looking at these very complex scientific information services that originate with climate scientists and the natural sciences, but then thinking, well, how do we then get that information to all sorts of different users? It can be, mid-level government users who might have some understanding of science. It could be community level organizations who might have less of an understanding of the level of science that we're talking about, and it could be illiterate individual citizens who might be subsistence farmers, for example. And so there are real challenges there in translating that information in the right way into something that they can understand and then act upon. And I think that's the key here. It's supposed to aid decision making. And so through all these different users and these different interactions, there are many applications for human computer interaction in that space.
And can you give me some examples of particular user types and the
sure.
kind of adaptations that you've had to make based on that and the research you found?
So we're generally focusing on rural communities in East Africa as our end users, let's say. So if we're thinking of farmers in Kenya, for example, these are people who might have limited access to technology, but they might have a smartphone.
Right.
And when they do have smartphones, they use them a lot. Their entire lives, it seems, are often run on WhatsApp. So it could be, speaking to friends, speaking to community organizations. And so the way we would deliver information there would be very different from how we would do that for somebody in a different user group who might be an educated office worker, for example, who might be working for an NGO in the region.
And what challenges do the different contexts pose you in terms of kind of what you're designing?
Well, I think one of the main challenges as a Western researcher based in the UK is accessing the different user communities.
Right.
So, if we want to speak to farmers in East Africa, well, how do you go about that? And so for us, we've been partnering with local universities on the grant, but also local research assistants who are being recruited through our partners to get us kind of into communities. So, there's a protocol. So might be a community leader who wants to know, what are these people doing in my community? Because it's very much more collectivist than I am, or, we would be in the UK. And so...
what advice would you give to someone else attempting something similar or kind of carrying out research in a similar area?
Definitely partner with local organizations, especially if you are not part of that community from that country, because you won't understand the culture, you won't understand the challenges they face, you won't speak their language, and we don't want to do purely extractive research. We want to get people on board as well, and give opportunities to the local institutions there as well. So like we've been partnering with the University of Nairobi and other institutions in the region. other good advice. Use participatory methods,
right,
and user-centered methods, as we always do in HCI, to really understand the context of use and the user needs, because that's a really big problem at the moment in the climate services research area, is that the climate scientists are so disconnected from the people on the ground who are using this information to make very important decisions that they don't really understand their lives, how they use this information, and the types of information they need. So I think that's where HCI can really help here, is in establishing user needs and better understanding the user. It's just really come along in the past few months, really, hasn't it, with ChatGPT, etc., being released. So, I mean, there's already a language barrier in many cases in these systems. We're generally working in English. A lot of the scientific organisations are working in English, whereas a lot of people in rural communities will so in Kenya, for example, they'll be speaking Swahili, and they might understand some English, or they'll be speaking a very local language. And so I don't think that as far as I know, like for instance ChatGPT, I don't think it's going to cope with those local languages.
Right.
Perhaps in the future it will. But then it's a case of cost benefit, I suppose. If you want to do something that complex for a very small group of people, then there has to be obviously a very good reason for that. So I think if we assumed that everybody understood English, then there are definitely obvious applications for that. You can, if you want to know what the conditions are going to be like in the coming season or the coming week, then you can ask in a more conversational way, or ask them to put it in terms that you can understand better. So perhaps in the future there are applications for it, but I think at the moment we're looking at quite a long way down the line.
Right. And what about CHI itself? Is this your first time at CHI?
It's my second time at CHI. I went in 2018 when it was in Montreal.
Right.
And I was presenting a poster there, but this is the first CHI I've been to where I've actually made a proper presentation.
And what did you want if there's one thing you wanted your audience to take away from your session, what would it be?
So my paper was about how there isn't much crossover between the climate services research area and HCI. So I wanted to kind of, in a way, it was a bit of a call to action to map out different areas where people could contribute. So I hope that was the takeaway message, in that this is a very important area, and we need the expertise of HCI people, and then there are these different areas where people can contribute, so hopefully they can take something from that. And I always remember my PhD supervisor saying it should be an advert for your paper, which
Right.
it was. So I didn't really present any numbers of the data or anything. I just tried to advertise my paper and then get people to read it.
And you talked just now about the slight sort of disconnect between climate science and HCI. How do you see that being resolved, if you like?
So this is something I address in my paper, which I would very much encourage people to read. I think it has to start with funding collaborations, so
Right.
getting together with people and writing grants together.
Right.
Because a lot of the time, maybe there'll be some climate science happening, and then there'll be a very small amount of, what they would call user interaction,
Yep.
which we would probably laugh at.
Right.
So the HCI people really need to be involved from the very start.
Yep.
To instill user-centered methods, not just, throughout the entire process of everything that's done, not just the technology side of it. So I think, it's very much about being there from the very start and kind of baking a user-centered methodology into the entire project.
I had two studies. The first one was 10 participants. The second one was, I think, 450.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And the idea was in the context of smart lighting, kind
Yeah.
of the Philips Hue lighting,
Yeah.
different models of explanation, is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, I would like to talk about a bit more about the study. So what happens is that, we designed two different studies. In the first study, it's more like a qualitative, semi-structured interview, and the 10 participants is all from the Philips Hue beta community. It's an inner user community that's already familiar and kind of committed to Philips Hue brand.
Right.
And in this the interview, we explored what's attitude and what do people think of explanations. So we provided 3 different scenarios and with 3 different explanation types. So to put it in a very easy to understand way, is we designed some kind of home dilemmas. So we provide user as something, for example, if the user's brushing the teeth and the light all of a sudden just dim down. And the user could be so confused, like what is happening. And in this sense, we would like the system to explain to the user why I dim your lights down, because the system doesn't want to bother, because when a new person enters a room, you don't want to blind the new person in the mornings. So the system is actually making a nice decision for you and not having any bugs.
And when you say explain, how does the system do that? Is that a text explanation, or is the system like verbally explaining to you?
No. So in this way, we're actually based on the Philips Hue app,
Right.
The system. So we're going to have already embedded notification.
Right.
And the notification is a combination of an icon,
Right.
which roughly tells you what is happening, and the system status. Basically tells the system is still working.
Right.
And then one explanation, very short one. So we provide the users 2 different explanation types. One is we explain to them in a more personal touch, in a way that with social presence. So I think it's called the hedonic aspect of
Right.
explanation.
Right.
So we say, for example, we dim the lights down to provide not to blinding the new person's presence. We're doing it for you, for your comfort. And we use the first pronoun, we.
Right.
Yeah, and for the other explanation, what we did is we just use a very efficient way, a very efficient communication style focused on the informativeness, which means we just explain to the users the system dim down the light for the new presence. So it's short, informative, and it's more lack of the social presence.
And what were the results, Kiwi, of your research?
So we actually have 2 different type of results. The first one, we compare the different explanations, and we find that I think it's unlike some of the other expectations. For example, for the smart assistants, for ChatGPT, or for like the home voice assistant, people might expect them to communicate more nicely. In our research, we found people would expect their lighting system to be just informative, just efficient, informative, and just basically in an efficient way.
Right.
Yeah, and we also, the other part that we do find, I think it's very interesting to talk about, is that we do find, based on the technology acceptance model, so we actually explore the relationship between different constructs related to perceived control, perceived ease of use, perceived usefulness, and adoption intention. So what's interesting is that we do find if users receive explanation of what the system is doing, they actually feel a little bit less in control. However, they still feel the system is easier to use.
That's fascinating. So if the system tells them why it's doing something,
Yeah.
they feel kind of disempowered.
Yeah. Yeah. So
why do you think that is?
So we actually explore a little bit more of why people would think so. There might be 2 different explanations in this way. The first is, as when users quote, the system is patronizing. This means if they see an explanation, they think, oh, I didn't know that you exist. I didn't know that you are spying on me. And you're pushing these decisions to me. And I now feel like you initiated my perceived risk. So I feel like there's risk. I feel like my privacy is being kind of intruded.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And to what extent did that surprise you, or to what extent did you expect that when you started the research?
No, it's absolutely surprised me, because our assumption is that, because I think that's very easy to understand. If the system explains to you, you understand a bit more of the system, hence you are more controlled of the system. But this is actually unexpected finding for us. Yeah, and we also find that also might be, for example, the users might have different mindsets or the mental models of how the system works. If the system make decisions and they don't say anything, they might think the system is dumb. Right. They think there's just errors in the system, it's working in a weird way. But if you actually tells the user, actually we're making these considerations for you because this and that, they think, oh, the system is smarter than I think. It's not what I expected. It's inconsistent of what I think you is. you are. Yeah.
So what implications does this have for design of such systems going forward?
Yeah, so I think for the design implications, the most practical way is we could give this recommendations for the users or for different designer developers who's doing similar human AI systems, is that you need to be really careful because the effect of having explanation can be subtle and can be really complex. It can have both a negative and positive impact, especially in the short run, because currently I think users' mental model is not prepared for the system to all of a sudden making decisions for them and become smart.
Right. Kind of the Internet of Things more broadly, what do designers and researchers need to think about when they're designing? Obviously, this context is smart lighting, but the Internet of Things has a much broader application, obviously. What would you say?
I mean, for me, I would say I think the implication is more like in the long run to say we explore a little bit more, because we generally in our mental system, in our mindset, we generally think the things should be this way or that way, but when we actually testing it, we find like user is thinking something that we don't actually know. So I think in a broader perspective, I think it's more just don't make assumptions, or you always need to test the hypothesis. Like in this way, we didn't even expect at all that giving explanation to users can make them think they'll take less control. So I think in this sense that really surprised us. And again, I think we need to put more cares and attention to these nuances in different systems. For example, I think people's expectations for a robot cleaner, for lighting, or for temperature control system at home is completely different than a voice assistant. And we also see that, for example, if the voices, if you use really polite words to voice assistant, you say, "Could you do this for me?" While if you robot cleaner bump into the wall, you don't feel anything, right? So it's really, I think humans' mind when they're building models are really nuanced. So just put more effort and put more attention to these small things. Yeah.
And final question.
Yeah.
What does the future hold for the Internet of Things, do you think?
Well, I have several beliefs in my own defense. So first, as I think what they call slow technology or calm technology, this part I genuinely believe, because currently I think most of the applications, for example, like TikTok or e-commerce apps, what they want to do is they're trying to grab your attention as much as they can. Any kind of attention, as long as you put to them, they are so happy about it, and they want to make you addicted to the app. But I think in terms of Internet of Things, especially in a smart home context, I think what they should do is actually to make you care less. They should slowly and silently guess your preferences and do their job in a way that you don't need to care them too much. This is one of the trends. I deeply personally believe it, because I would not expect because the current smart home systems just require so much deep customization, it's like you're babysitting them. That's not the future we want. We want a future that we care almost nothing, and the system should do the right work for me.
Fantastic. Yeah, so the talk was about, again, user experience of recommendation on streaming sites, but particularly focusing on algorithm experience as a lens. So really trying to understand how users are relating to recommendations. And part of that was doing a design workshop to kind of imagine what a future or ideal music recommender might be like, which was really fun. So a couple of the key findings were that, so the nuances to the music listening experience, in particular, the one that's most interesting to me was this notion of vibe. And this was this term that everybody used in all of their interviews and also in the workshops. And it could mean lots of different things. It could be a verb, like I'm vibing with something or I'm vibing with someone. It could be a noun describing the music as particularly vibey. But for me, it was really interesting because it's a more kind of intimate and holistic way to look at music recommendation, but also users' satisfaction with and how they understand the stuff that they're getting recommended. So it's much more personal and intimate than perhaps what they're currently getting on music streaming sites.
And I was fascinated by the methodology used, because it's more akin to the kind of work that I do in a sort of commercial setting, in terms of the semi-structured interviews I think you did, and then the design workshop. Tell me more about that and how you run that.
Sure. Semi-structured interviews with 15 users, and they were such amazing interviews. People spoke for so long. I think I had sort of 15 or 16 hours worth of interview transcripts. And questions were really about their experiences of using music streaming, but I really wanted to focus on their attitudes and their perceptions as well of the recommended content. So while we were doing the interviews and asking questions, I invited them to also show me on their devices their streaming service that they were using, which was useful because it was a prompt for them to help them to remember, but also allowed them to look at a playlist or look at recommended content and actually tell me what their reactions were. And the reactions were often very funny, and they'd say, like, is this for me? Like, what is this doing here? So that was a really interesting technique. And then the design workshop was great. I invited the same participants back, and we got to explore the same ideas or the themes from the first stage in a bit more depth. And that was a really fun thing to do too. And using the design workshop as a kind of a speculative design, so thinking about what it might be like in the future as a sort of critique on the current state of things.
And out of interest, how did you find those participants? Kind of what was your recruitment process?
Sure. So online, through the university as well, a little bit of snowballing. So I asked some people, once I'd had some interviews, I did ask if they knew anyone that would be interested. And the participants were mostly, I think the age range was sort of 18 to 40. And they tended to be really interested in music, which is probably why they signed up to do the research. But this also raised some interesting questions that came up during the review process, but also for me personally, that who's the expert? So they were really keen music listeners, or maybe they had they were DJs, or they might play an instrument, but they weren't necessarily like power users of the technology. So a lot of them didn't know where certain features were. So it raises interesting questions for me around expertise in the context, for sure.
So what implications does this have for designers in this space in terms of those people, design teams, research teams working on building, whether it be music streaming services or other related kind of algorithmic based services?
Sure. I think I sort of cheekily say at the end of the session that it raises more questions than it answers, and I don't necessarily have the answers, but I think that attending to these nuances and to the algorithm experiences of individual users gives a more holistic picture of what people are really looking for, but also how they're receiving those recommendations. So I think things like vibe, and something I wasn't able to talk about in the presentation yesterday was that the musical associations and the memories attached to music and how they're really important to people and really affect how they receive recommendations, and how we design for that. That's a big challenge, but I think that these are really interesting directions, and it's all about empowering users and allowing a little bit more control and a bit more feedback from them. And yeah, I think that's the way forward, but lots of questions.
Lots of questions.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to know as well, kind of from a cultural, national kind of context. Obviously, you're based in Australia. You're doing research with Australian users. What's your sense of how your findings would translate kind of globally in terms of other types of music, other cultures, what the user representation would be?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I briefly thought about, but because a lot of the research is sort of around music, I should say, is really siloed. There's a lot of geographic specific research. There's a particular concentration in Norway, which is really interesting too, and which makes sense also because Spotify is from Sweden, and there's a lot of, in that part of the world, the Nordic countries, there's a lot of uptake of streaming in particular. But as far as Australian users go, that is a really tricky question. I feel like I don't know if I have the answer right now. I think I need to think about it a little bit more. I think that the Australian, or at least the Melbourne, it's a really specific place for music. Melbourne, the city, has a big connection to live music. We've had a lot of both public and government pressure to keep live music alive, and I think that really affected the users that I interviewed. They were really connected to the musicians and groups that they really liked.
And what's your sense of where HCI as a discipline is going, if it's even possible to kind of answer that?
I guess I can only speak to the direction that I'm interested in, that I've been following, but I really think that I'm really interested in the push towards understanding users' emotions, research that has a lot more empathy, that's much more about users' mental health, users' emotion, users' attitudes and perceptions towards technology. I saw a really interesting talk today that was about attachment theory for algorithms, or in the Instagram algorithm. So I think there's some really interesting research that's really trying to get at a more sort of empathetic understanding of users, and that's something I'm personally really interested in.
And what about the challenges and risks, if I can put it like that, that these developments place on us as researchers and also on users? Generative AI is used a lot as kind of, we're seeing a lot of that in talks. What are the risks that poses to people designing and kind of building services, and also to kind of users themselves?
Absolutely. I think a lot about generative AI in the music context because it has huge ramification for content creators, for musicians, right?
Yeah.
And it raises really interesting ethical and legal questions around authorship, and outside of music we see that in other contexts. Any time it's sort of human creativity is coming up against generative AI, I think we're going to have some really big discussions and big challenges in the future, and I think it's going to be up to all of the stakeholders that you just mentioned, designers, researchers and users, to come up collaboratively with the answers to that, because it's pretty pressing.
I would say the most important thing we do there is looking at power relations in participatory design. So when you have a design activity, there's always the question who decides what and when. And we did studies with older adults for 5 years. When you're looking at designing, there's mostly the designers and the participants, and in the end, mostly the designers decide what to do with a workshop result, you name it. So, and what we want to do when we do participatory design is look at how we could shift the power so that maybe the users could design and make decisions in the design process. And that's the one thing. And the second thing we have to look at is when we do most UX design and research, it's mostly one directional. We as the researchers, or we as maybe UX designers, always ask the participants or the users, how do you do that? How do you want to have that? And then we try to design things from that information, right? But when we do participatory research or participatory design, it's always a mutual consent, or it should be a mutual consent.
Tell me, how do you think UX and design as a discipline is evolving? Where do you see it going?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, learning from Kai, there were a lot of sessions and a lot of papers about artificial intelligence, and I would say that's an area we have to look at in the future. Even my research, even when we do active involving people, we now have to look at, or should look at, how we maybe can also involve the artificial intelligence in this co-creation space, and where maybe this also shifts the power relations again between the designers and the participants, and that I would say is a very important thing for the future.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you about AI, because like you, there was so much. I was really struck by how much stuff there was about AI and generative AI at the conference, and you sort of touched on this. But I was going to ask you around the implications for designers, us as designers, researchers, of the implications of AI on the work we do.
There's so much to explore, I think. I mean, I studied computer science first, and when I studied computer science, they always said, AI won't come to this point in the next 20 to 30 years, and now we were struck by it, and I think it was November, October last year. And now we have to find out ways how to incorporate artificial intelligence into our work. Maybe you have to distinguish between research and designing in this area. I think research could be very enhanced by artificial intelligence, because when we're writing text and when we try to generate ideas, artificial intelligence is a very good way to mass produce new ideas in the future.
There's a lot of optimism around AI, but what are the challenges, and I guess what are the risks as well, for participatory designers, let's say, in the work you're doing?
Yeah, I think biases is the most important thing, or the hugest risk we're gonna face, or we're already facing. There's so many anecdotes or stories out there when we're looking at AI. I mean, the problem with, or the most important problem with AI is that it's based on data sets from the past, right? But the data sets from the past are they got problems with race, with ethnics, and maybe even with the feminine view of things. So when you now try to generate an AI generated image, and you try to generate an image and have women depicted, it's almost every time sexualized, right? And that's a problem. So bias and the data set we have.
And what advice would you give to someone wanting to move into or kind of adopt a participatory design approach?
I would say when you try to adopt a participatory design approach, it always starts with your mindset. You have to reflect at what you want to do and how you want to design. Also, what's the goal you want to try to pursue, and also not try to look at your goals, but also look at the goals the users have.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Understanding Users, and special thanks to my guests Eva Wolfangel, Sophie Freeman, Kiwi Dai, Jake Rigby, and Torben Volkmann. If you enjoyed what you heard, do please like or comment wherever you're listening, and feel free to share this episode more widely. And feel free, of course, to drop me a line with any feedback via LinkedIn or my website, researchable.uk. Thanks as well to our sponsor, Oxford Insights. Join me again next time when I'll be sharing some more insights from digital design professionals. Until then, stay safe and stay user-centered.